1470 AM, 96.3 FM, The Source.
All right, 25 minutes before 11 o'clock. Thank you for tuning in. The closest I'll ever come to flying an airplane is the flight simulator on the computer of it. That's the closest I'll ever come. We have a wonderful flight school here in Ocala,
Yes,
Ocala
we do.
Aviation, and I know a lot of you have at least gone to do that discovery flight, right? You and I did the discovery flight. That was really cool, and I realized when you know, there's so much more to being a pilot of a little airplane than simply flying the airplane. You have to know so much about maintaining it, because if it breaks down, you can't pull off to the side of the road.
No. No.
It's a whole different animal, right? And so the closest I'll ever come to it is what I've already done just a handful of times, is to be a passenger in one of the private airplanes. And I have no idea. I have no idea if the pilot was doing things safely or not. And I don't even know if I would say something. Are you sure you're supposed to be doing that?
Yeah, right,
I think I'd have a hard time with that. There's a book here, and this guy has so many great credentials. John O. Graybill is on the phone. He is an active aviator. He's been flying for more than 50 years. He was designated by the Federal Aviation Administration as a master pilot. He holds a commercial pilot certificate, single and multi-engine rating. I'm reading, so I don't even know what I'm reading. He has a glider rating. There's a glider over in is it Homosassa Springs?
Yes.
Oh my gosh,
Cool.
it's sitting at that little airport over there. I always would love. I don't know if I want to be in it. I would just like to see it, like coming back down. He's a certified flight instructor, an instrument pilot, and an author. For those of you over at Ocala Aviation, if you're listening. Hopefully we'll be able to pass the book on to Dan. Dan is one of the owners of the station, and
Yep.
he's also a certified pilot. Private Airplane Passenger Safety is the name of the book. Good morning, John Graybill. It's an honor to have you on our show.
Good morning, Larry and Robin. Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. Where are you?
San Diego.
Well, thank you for getting up early to be with us. It's a beautiful world, isn't it, when you're up in an airplane? I just love the way the world looks. Is that what attracted you to it in the first place?
Well, that's one of the things, but I look at private airplanes as a legitimate transportation tool that can get you places faster and more efficiently than other forms of transportation.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, I think from here to Key West is like a third of the time it would take to drive it. I think that's what Dan told us. And sure, I'm sure you're familiar with that. So tell me this book is not for the pilot though. This is for me as a passenger, right?
That's correct. Most passengers of private airplanes don't have a clear understanding of their pilot's actions and behaviors and how those things may impact the safety of the envisioned flight.
And is that because we are more likely to fly on the big jets than in a private airplane?
Well, not necessarily. I think that people who find themselves flying in private airplanes evaluate their pilots by looking at how successful the pilot is in other aspects of his or her life, and whether or not it's a close friend or a relative. And there's sort of a natural assumption that if those things are true, that he's probably okay to fly with.
Right. Yeah. That's what I would think.
But there are a lot of things you can observe in your pilot that can indicate whether we have a yellow flag situation or a red flag situation. In the book, I identify pilot observations of the pilot that the passengers might make, and rate them by a yellow flag concern or a red flag.
Okay.
Red flag, you don't want to go. You probably don't want to go.
So these are
or three yellow flags. Maybe you don't want to go.
Okay. So are these observations we make before you ever get in the plane?
Yes, for the most part.
Okay.
Although some of them can only be made after you're in the plane and flying, in which case you're going to have to decide if that's going to impact any future flights you might make with the pilot.
So tell me what would we do? What would I do if I had a red flag while we're 3,000 feet up in the air?
That's a tough one.
Okay. I guess prayer. Maybe prayer is the thing on that one.
I guess because of maybe a buzzing. I know my brother-in-law was the pilot of a private airplane. It only sat 4 people, and when he and his brother would fly over their mother's house in Bellevue, they would drop low to treetop level, and then they would say hi by moving their wings back and forth, or the whole plane.
Oh,
so
man.
that's one of the things you point out in the book.
Right. That's one of the things that is sort of fun and exciting, but dangerous. And there have been numerous accidents associated with people buzzing and doing exactly what you described.
Okay.
So that would, I would say, if you were going to get on a plane and the pilot announced to you, hey, on our way to wherever we're going to go, I want to fly low over my mother's house. that would be a very strong yellow flag, maybe even a red flag. And you probably should, if you're not totally comfortable with that, you probably should say something to the pilot. This book wasn't meant to demonize pilots, and most pilots are interested in their passengers having a fun and positive experience. So if you have a concern as a passenger, if you voice it to the pilot, most likely, and it's been my experience, the pilot will make an adjustment to accommodate your concern.
Okay, tell me some of the big red flag ones. I'm flipping through the book as you're talking. I think one of them, having consumed alcohol, is an easy one to see, and I would say that's kind of a no-brainer for everybody. I don't know how. I mean, you'd have to say never mind.
Well, here's the problem with the alcohol thing is that a little bit of alcohol consumed while on the ground might seem okay, but what happens is the effects of the alcohol increase as the airplane climbs higher and higher where the air is thinner and thinner.
Wow.
So you might think it's okay when you're on the ground, and maybe it is okay, but then when you get higher, then you maybe have a problem. Anyway, that's something you don't want to fool with, and I give that a red flag if there's any sense that the pilot consumed alcohol. And there are rules. The rule is that you shouldn't consume alcohol, any alcohol, within 8 hours of your flight. And even that might not be good enough.
So I think the alcohol one is one that if I never opened up the book, I would have thought, okay, that's probably one of the things. But I never would have thought some of the things were things we should be worried about. Open-toed shoes, for example, or warning of the possibility of turbulence. Those 2 things are in the book also.
Exactly. It turns out that airports have all these hard points built into the ground or the asphalt to secure the planes when they're not flying with ropes and chains. And those things are very easy to stumble over, and I can't tell you how many times I've had friends and passengers cut their feet on those tie-down implements.
Mm-hmm. You said that your wife had a bad experience.
That's true, and that's part of the motivation for writing the book. Before I knew her, and before she was a pilot, she had no aviation experience at all. She went for a ride with a friend in a light airplane and had a very unpleasant and frightening experience that ultimately worked itself out. But when she was telling me the story, I realized, wow, she had no idea how to judge the pilot's behavior and actions and attitudes. So
that is
it seems
really
to me that there are
scary.
a lot of passengers are in that situation. So I decided to write the book.
How about pets? I mean, people are taking their pets everywhere, to the mall, the grocery store. I imagine they must be taking them on the airplanes as well.
They do, and that's a pilot discretion. If the pilot is okay with it, it certainly can be done safely. And many people take dogs on their airplanes or pets on their airplanes with no problem at all.
One of the things in the book I need a little explanation on. It says you notice a yellow flag. You notice that when your pilot is talking on the airplane radio, he does not mention the airplane altitude when maneuvering for landing or taking off from an airport that does not have an FAA control tower. Explain that one. That sounds like it's a little over my head.
Well, most airports don't have control towers. That sometimes seems surprising, but of the thousands and thousands of airports, a small minority have control towers. So if you go to an airport that does not have a control tower, you self-report over the radio frequency that's been designated for that particular airport. And you say who you are, where you are, and how high you are. And many pilots don't mention altitude. They'll say, I'm 5 miles north of the airport, headed towards the airport. Well, that's interesting, but it would be helpful to know what the altitude of that airplane is.
But what do you do? I mean, at that point.
Well, there's little you can do except make note of it. If you're in the airplane and you notice this, and maybe you can raise it as a concern when you land, and the pilot he is able to give his full attention to the concern.
And it's very scary. I have a neighbor who's a commercial airline pilot, and they took off from our airport here in Marion County, which is a small airport, in the small plane, because his friend wanted to have hours piloting. So he let his friend pilot the airplane down to Orlando, and once they were going to the Orlando airport, the guy from the control tower came on and said there was this jet like 3 miles away, and then he said it was like 2.5 miles, and then he said it's 2 miles and you got to expedite, and the pilot just froze. He didn't know what he was talking about. So my friend just took over the controls and did what he had to do to get out of the way of that big jet. And that could be pretty scary too for the person that's learning how to be a pilot and getting his flying hours in. He doesn't think anything like that is going to happen.
That's true.
The only green flag in the book, I think, is the one where you recommend that if we want to really be on top of everything, to actually go and get some flying lessons ourselves. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's a great experience. It's good for you. It exercises your brain, and it can be a lot of fun.
So have you ever been a passenger and you were noticing some of the yellow or red flags, and did you say something?
No, I've not had that experience.
Oh, my gosh.
There are people in our area that are scuba divers. They love to scuba dive and go to the Bahamas. It's not that far from Florida. And how do you manage to have people that are scuba divers bringing their air tanks and everything that are under pressure with them in a private plane like that?
Well, the big concern with scuba diving is if you do dives to a safe depth, and do that for several hours, and then come out of the water and jump in the airplane and go to altitude, you run the risk of getting the bends, even though you dove to a safe depth.
Oh.
So that really should be a yellow flag item, I think, and in the next edition of the book, I'll include that.
One of the things that I've always been concerned about, and I've never been in a small private plane that landed in a major airport where there are large jets also landing at the same time. Yeah, and I don't know that this applies to the book, by the way, but how does that, and I guess I could ask the guys here at the flight school here, but how does a small pilot fit in with all of that? Is there a protocol? How do you fly when there's a gigantic 727 or whatever coming in? I don't even know if that is an airplane, is it? So I don't know. I don't even know what I'm saying here. But you know what I mean? If there's a big jet landing at Kennedy Airport, and you're also landing at Kennedy Airport, how do you two survive together? How does that work?
Well, you start with very careful planning before you arrive at the airport.
That sounds
and I mean, it really helps. I mean, if you just jump in the plane and fly to one of those large, busy airports, it's going to be a stressful experience, most likely. But if you spend time planning and looking at the literature about that airport, there's lots of resources, both on the internet and in printed pages, that can prepare the pilot for arriving at a big airport like that. There's radio frequencies to be concerned about. Big airports like that tend to have special procedures for smaller airplanes, and you have to read up on those. So if you have the right equipment and you do the right preparation, landing at big airports can be done quite safely.
Well, how did you personally adapt to all of the changes over your 50-plus career of flying? Because you came from private airplanes to the commercial airplanes, and there must be a lot more technology now than when you first started.
Yes, a lot more. With the advent of GPS, that's really had a big impact on aviation, and the equipment that's available for navigating is just amazing.
How do you know when you are teaching your students and they get certified in the small planes, and then they say they want to go into being a commercial pilot? Do you have a gut instinct that tells you that some of them will make the grade and some will not?
I guess so. I haven't really thought about that. Most of the people that I've talked to that started off flying small planes and graduated into being airline pilots had fire in the belly and a passion to do it. It's something they really, really wanted to do, and they worked very hard to become qualified to do it, and knocked on a lot of doors and went on interviews and finally landed a job with a major air carrier.
On Amazon, I found the book with you getting really good reviews. The description says this: your pilot may be a good friend, a nice person, your spouse or close relative, but can you tell if he or she is being a safe pilot? In the book, Private Airplane Passenger Safety, Master Pilot John O. Graybill identifies what every passenger needs to know in easy-to-understand, non-technical language that could save your life. And there's a lot of things in this book that I never, ever would have thought of. I mean, a pilot telling me that we might reach icy conditions, for example, I would just say, oh, okay, well, and I would assume, you know, what was the thing in Seinfeld? Do you remember Seinfeld would be in a taxi in New York, and he would say, how, it must be safe. These guys are professionals, right? I think it's the same thing we do. We get into an airplane, we say, oh, he's going to ice. He must know what he's doing, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, ice can be a problem, and if your pilot seems to be unconcerned about the fact that you're going to be flying in icing conditions, that should be a concern, certainly a yellow flag.
How did, when JFK Jr.'s flight, when his plane went down, how did that affect you? Was there something that you might have thought about in hindsight that might have prevented it, or was that the investigation done to your satisfaction?
Well, yes, but I mourn for the passengers. He had passengers in that airplane. Maybe if they had read the book and maybe they had asked a couple of questions that they would have gotten from the book, maybe he wouldn't have made the flight. I don't know. You know, that's speculation on my part, but my sense was the passengers just sort of got in the plane, and even though they were being rushed and they were late and they were going to be flying in the dark, no one seemed to express any concern at all. Apparently didn't even ask a question.
Wow.
I guess. Now, I'm guessing now. I wasn't there, of course, and don't know for sure, but that's the way it feels.
You know, it would be really scary to have to know all of these things and then actually notice them. We have, we live in a very tourist area, and so there are, mostly in the Orlando area, like these tourist helicopters. You pay $20, they take you up on a helicopter ride, and they do that over and over. That's what they do all day long, these guys. Do the rules for the small airplane apply to the helicopter pilot as well?
For the most part, yes.
Yeah.
And how about the guys that give skydiving lessons? Because those planes seem to be put through the ringer. They're constantly taking off and landing, a few hundred times a day. I mean, how can they be sure that equipment that's in the engine and driving the plane is safe?
Well, that's a good question, and if you're going to be a skydiving passenger, you need to consider those things and ask some questions.
There's one part of the book I would like a little explanation on. Why is, and this probably seems like elementary for you, but I never knew this before. Why is it dangerous if an airport is at 4,000 feet, for example? Why is it dangerous for a pilot to take off on a hot day?
Well, if the airport is at 4,000 feet or more and it's a hot day, the air is less dense and there's less oxygen in the air for the engine to breathe and for the wings to generate lift. And what happens is, whereas an airplane at sea level might require only 2,000 feet to get airborne, at a higher airport it might take 5,000 or 6,000 feet to get airborne, and then even then, once you get airborne, the performance of the plane is diminished. And there have been accidents where people have tried to take off from high altitude airports on a hot day and had a problem.
Okay, and it's always a hot day around here, but I'm guessing we're at low enough altitude it doesn't matter.
Correct.
Okay.
That's exactly right.
Should a pilot trust his mechanic every time he goes to take off from the airport in a small plane, or should that pilot actually go through the checklist himself?
Well, prior to the flight, the pilot should do a pre-flight inspection of the airplane, and that inspection should be driven by a written checklist. And if the pilot is doing the inspection without a checklist handy to confirm that he hasn't missed anything, that's a yellow flag.
And how can pilots go up knowingly they don't have, about fuel and stuff? Because we were told that John Denver crashed his plane because he was low on fuel, but he went up anyway.
Well, from what I've read about that accident, it wasn't so much low fuel, but the way it was an amateur-built airplane, and we talk about that in the book, Experimental Airplanes. And apparently there was some difficulty. He had some difficulty in reaching a fuel valve to direct fuel from one tank to the other, I think. And I might not have the facts exactly right, but it was something like that.
Oh my gosh. Didn't realize that.
The book is going to go to the Ocala Aviation. We usually give the book away at random, but we already have a designated recipient of the book. So I would recommend you go online. You can get it on Amazon. It's a Kindle, it's a hardcover, and it's a paperback. Do you have a different website you want to recommend?
NiceFlightJoy.com. NiceFlightJoy.
With no W's.
No W's.
Yeah.
Well, you could have www.niceflightjoy.com.
Okay. Niceflightjoy.com. John Graybill, thank you so much for doing this. Have you ever flown to Ocala? Have you ever flown around here, I should say?
I flew to Orlando and then went across over to the Grand Bahama and then back to Miami and then back up to Nebraska where I was based at that time.
Oh, wow. All the way from here to Nebraska?
Say again?
You could fly one of those little planes all the way from here to Nebraska?
Oh, sure. Not nonstop. We've flown all over the United States. We tend to have legs that are like 2 to 3 hours, because you're limited by the strength of your physiology, since there are no restrooms on most.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. I got you. And I'm guessing everybody listening over at the airport probably just cringed at my question, probably every question, actually.
So when you are flying a 4-seater plane, that means the pilot and 3 passengers and some luggage then. Do some people try to squish in one more person?
Possibly, but that's very unwise.
Yeah.
You shouldn't do that. You really need a set of seat belts and shoulder harnesses for everybody that's on the plane.
Well, you have so many years of flight under your belt. You obviously are giving us some really great information. John, thank you for taking your time to do this. And I would love to have you back on like in a year or so. And how much feedback did you get from anybody who perhaps avoided a dangerous flight because of the information you've given them?
That'd be great.
Yeah, I'm sure you'll get those. And you know what? Like Red Skelton used to say, if I made one person laugh, I did my job. If you save one life, you've done your job.
Yes.
You know?
That's exactly right. Yeah.
John, thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, we'll be right back.
Bye-bye.
The
The weather is brought to you by myfwc.com. Safe boating is no accident. Monday, a mix of sun and clouds with a thunderstorm in spots in the afternoon and evening. High 86 to 89. Later Monday night, partly cloudy, low 72 to 74. Tuesday and Wednesday, partly sunny with an afternoon and evening thunderstorm in spots. High Tuesday, 88 to 91, and Wednesday's high 88 to 90. From the Florida Weather Center, I'm meteorologist Steve Travis.
Broadcasting from the Paddock Mall Studios, this is WOCA, Ocala, Gainesville, The Villages, 1370 AM, 96.3 FM, The Source.
Fox News Radio. I'm Lillian Wu. Some decisions could be coming out on some of the Supreme Court's biggest cases this session as it nears the end of its term, one which could have national implications.
The justices set to rule on the legality of President Trump's controversial travel ban, nearly 1 year after the administration announced its third revision of the policy.
Fox's Sandra Smith. Justices today choosing not to hear and ordering Washington courts to take a new look at a case of a florist who refused to provide services for a same-sex wedding. The president on Twitter trashing the restaurant, which asked White House Press Secretary Sarah Sanders to leave.
The owner, Stephanie Wilkinson, told the Washington Post, quote, "I am not a huge fan of confrontation. I have a business, and I want the business to thrive. This feels like the moment in our democracy when people have to make uncomfortable actions and decisions to uphold their morals."
Fox's Denton Kelway. Fox News. We report. You decide.
Ever wonder why Miller High Life is called the champagne of beers? Because it's a flavorful, easy-drinking beer with a perfect storm of tiny champagne-like bubbles. And it's been that way since 1903.
If you've got the time,
welcome to the High Life.
We've got the beer, Miller Beer.
2018 Miller Brewing Company, Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Drink High Life responsibly.
Pros in the know start with Lowe's, because Lowe's makes it easy for pros to save money on what they need to finish or update any property, like ceiling fans and fixtures. Now you can get up to 25% off Hunter ceiling fans for a limited time. Plus, you can save time by ordering ahead on Lowe'sForPros.com, and your order will be ready for pickup in-store at our Pro Desk. So, Pro, now that you know, start with Lowe's. Offer valid through July 9 while supplies last. Selection varies by location.
It's time to rethink what you know about clean American propane and what it can do for your operation. Want efficient, reliable power independent of the grid? Propane can do that. Power for EPA-compliant engines without all the extra fluids and filters? Propane can do that. Eliminate fuel theft, lower hourly fuel costs, reduce downtime. Propane can do all of that. Discover all the things propane can do on your farm at propanecandothat.com.
Here are today's headlines from The Source, WOCA. The Ocala Police Department is investigating a shooting yesterday morning at a gas station. Police say 2 people were shot at the Circle K on West State Road 40 near I-75. Police say the victims ran to the Waffle House across the street after being shot. Both victims were transported to a local hospital with non-life-threatening injuries. No other information on the shooting has been released. Anyone with information about the shooting is asked to call the Ocala Police Department at 352-369-7000. An Ocala family says they had rims stolen off of their Ford F-150 pickup truck while the truck was in their driveway. The theft of the rims, valued at around $2,400, was captured on security cameras on the home. Ronald Burton said he has been working on the matte black truck since 2016, and on his wife's 35th birthday, he gave it to her as a present. Burton said, as a husband and as a father, you try to fix everything, but it was one of those moments where we just felt violated, unquote. A Palatka man is accused of hiding in gator-infested waters after trying to drown a canine police dog in an effort to run from police. To various police, a 22-year-old Austin Winters was reported to be acting strange and lurking around cars in the parking lot of the Florida Health Waterman Hospital. According to the arrest report, Winters shoved the responding officers, ran away, and then jumped into a nearby gator-infested pond where he hid until sunrise a short time later. Lake County Sheriff's deputies helped in the search
March. Deputy James Simmons and canine partner Eek ran into the murky water where, during a violent struggle, Simmons says Winters grabbed Eek by the harness and tried to pull him under the water to drown the dog. Simmons was able to pull Winters closer to shore, where backup officers helped make an arrest. Winters is facing multiple counts, including resisting an officer with violence, battery on a law enforcement officer, loitering, and offense against a police dog. Florida's chief financial officer reimbursed the state for using a state-owned SUV, but only after he was questioned about it. Chief financial officer Jimmy Petronas paid more than $4,000 in May for using a state-owned Chevrolet Tahoe. Spokesman John Moore said Petronas stopped using the Tahoe in November, but made the reimbursement months later out of an abundance of caution. This payment, however, came right after a reporter asked Petronas about using the state vehicle. Politico reported Petronas' payment on Friday while using the Tahoe in October. Petronas had an accident in Tallahassee and received a ticket. Petronas was traveling to his political consultant's office to pick up thank you cards. A video posted on Twitter over the weekend shows protesters shouting at Florida Attorney General Pam Bondi outside of a movie theater in Tampa. Bondi had just attended a Friday night showing of the Mr. Rogers documentary, Won't You Be My Neighbor, when she was confronted over her policies on health care and immigration.
What would Mr. Rogers think about you and your legacy in Florida? Taking away health insurance with people with pre-existing conditions, Pam Bondi.
Police escorted her safely away from the theater as the protesters yelled, "Shame on you." The Tampa Bay Times reports that Bondi said the protesters' actions were at odds with Mr. Rogers' lessons of peace, love, and tolerance. Florida is known as a very low tax state, and the numbers back up that reputation. But when you add in local property tax revenue, we're back up to near average. Economist Kurt Wenner with Florida Tax Watch says cities and counties in Florida took on a lot of spending a decade ago.
Right before the Great Recession, when property values were skyrocketing, local governments didn't show a lot of restraint and spent most of that windfall money that came in.
Florida also relies more on local taxes to fund government than most other states, and the amount that local taxes take out of our pockets is slightly above the national average. We're 49th in per capita tax collection statewide, but for local taxes, we're 27th. Denise Maloney of the Hernando County Sheriff's Office says there's been a development in the disappearance of a Forest Service ranger.
Detectives have recovered the body of Mitzi Marie Babb. They recovered the body in Camden County, Georgia. The investigative leads, along with ongoing communication with various law enforcement agencies in southern Georgia, led the authorities there to the body of Ms. Babb.
Babb was last seen Tuesday late afternoon as she was leaving her job at the Croom Wildlife Management Area. Detectives tracked down her boyfriend, 42-year-old Jeffrey Morrison, near the Florida-Georgia state line. Right now, he's in custody on armed burglary and attempted arson charges out of Georgia. 4 juveniles and an adult who watched a 31-year-old man drown in a cocoa pond making video on their phones and mocking him will not face charges. Brevard State Attorney Phil Archer calls it a callous act, but says Florida law is not specific enough to prosecute them for what they did to Jamel Dunn. A law to change that failed in this year's legislative session. Along a stretch of white sandy shoreline in Florida's Panhandle, a simple question has led to profanity-laden arguments, private security guards, and calls to law enforcement. Who owns the beach? In one coastal county, that would be Walton County, a new state law is set to rekindle that uproar just in time for the 4th of July holiday. As of July 1st, Walton County Sheriff Michael Atkinson said his deputies will have to start arresting people who put their beach blankets down in front of private property and refuse to leave. A new state law establishes a process for counties to grant what is called customary use access to otherwise privately owned beaches. It goes into effect July 1st, just in time for the crowded beaches, but the new law won't change the current rights people have for the beach in Walton County. And Universal Orlando's newest hotel is hiring ahead of its grand opening. Universal's Aventura Hotel, set to open in August, will hold a hiring event June 29th and 30th. The 600-room hotel is seeking more than 300 new workers for a variety of positions, including culinary, housekeeping, engineering, and recreation. Those interested in applying are encouraged to register online for pre-interviews with recruiters. Opportunities are also available at Universal's 5 other on-site hotels, according to the hiring site. In addition to Aventura, Universal is set to open 2 other hotels in the next 2 years. Surfside Inn and Suites is set to debut in 2019, followed by Dockside Inn and Suites in 2020. Together, the hotels will create Universal's endless summer resort. And those are the headlines from The Source, WOCA 96.3 FM and 1370 AM.
The weather is brought to you by myfwc.com. Safe boating is no accident.